All right. Good morning, Erin. How are you?
I'm so great, thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you. Hey, I really appreciate you joining us for this segment of our BluePaz video series. This is going to be so helpful and so kind of, I think, outside of the box for a lot of people to be able to relate to. You and I had a chance to chat last week, and I told you, I said, "Hey, this is perfect. We need to be able to bottle this up and share it with the world." So thank you for doing this. I'll let you introduce yourself if you don't mind, and tell us what you're doing with your life and who you are and where you come from.
Sure, yeah, and it's absolutely my pleasure. I'm so excited to be talking to you this morning. And I'm actually from Connecticut originally. I'm living out here in Southern California to pursue my doctorate degree, but I grew up in Southern Connecticut my whole entire life until I moved out here about a year and a half ago. So a long time living in Connecticut. And my dad was a police officer my entire life. He was a police officer in a pretty dangerous city in Connecticut. And we lived in a really quiet town about 30 minutes away from the city. And so I didn't really know too much about that city growing up. But I'll get to that a little bit later. I have a sister and a wonderful mom, and she was a school teacher my entire life. So we just kind of had the normal American family living in the suburbs in Connecticut. Everything was always great growing up. I love sports. I was really close with my dad. My sister and I loved playing in the backyard, and we had a really, really great childhood. And I'll talk more, obviously, about growing up with a father who was a police officer. But really, I have such fond memories of Connecticut and growing up there. And just being a police officer's daughter is a little bit of a different spin, but you don't really notice it until you're, moving on and studying it as a PhD student.
Hmm. So true. I mean, and you were the older of the two of your siblings.
Younger, actually. My
You were
sister's
the
older.
younger one.
Yeah,
Okay. And so I wonder what her perspective on this entire thing too is, right? Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
but
she's 4 years older, so she probably has a totally different perspective.
wow, dude, that's another segment, I
Yeah,
suppose.
absolutely.
So here you are, you're growing up in Connecticut. Your dad was a cop. How long was he an officer for?
He was an officer for about 37 and a half years. So, and in the same department, never moved. He stayed right there for his whole career, excuse me. He passed away of cancer. He's on about halfway through his 37th year. So he worked up until he literally couldn't end how much he
He had a huge passion for his job, it sounds like, yeah.
really did. Yeah. If you asked him who he was, I think he would say police officer first, no matter what. It was who he was through and through for sure.
What particular areas did he work in? Which divisions or kind of specialty units?
He was all over. It's interesting. This is definitely something I wanted to chat with you about too. He rarely talked about his job at home. So I really only knew him as a police officer who fought bad guys in the middle of the night with his Batmobile in the driveway. And he would come home and kiss me on the forehead and wake me up and think that I was asleep, but he came home from his shift. So I didn't know too much about the ins and outs before he passed away. It was actually after he passed away that I started to learn more about him. And there was this moment where I was kind of going through his things and helping my mom pack up. And, that's always a really hard part when you lose someone, is you have to kind of take their stuff out of the room and, trying to kind of grieve and move on at the same time. And so I was, cleaning out some of his stuff. And he had boxes under the bed of all the articles of times he had been in the newspaper, of, whether it was a save or it was him getting hurt on the job or whatever it was, but he had saved them all, and put them in these boxes under the bed, almost like he was really proud of and it meant so much to him, but he never wanted to let my sister and I into that. I think a lot of it had to do with the fear of us being scared all the time, or, why is dad always in the newspaper? Why is he, on these chases? Or, when we would watch the news, he would really kind of watch us to make sure like he wouldn't be on the news and it wouldn't freak us out. But he was really proud he did. And so I started to kind of investigate and ask my mom and really learn more, because he was so closed off about it growing up. And so after I went through these boxes, I went down in the basement and he had all of his police books, like everything he had from the academy. He had his original binders from the 70s saved with his notes highlighted. And so I was really kind of immersing myself in Gosh, he's done a million things. So I know for a fact he worked narcotics and vice, and he worked on the night shift. He worked the night shift probably from when I was in elementary school through middle school, maybe a little into high school. He worked the night shift for a while. And then he also, I know he was on Central Command in the city. He was a captain, so he kind of worked his way up through the ranks. That I vaguely remember putting on a dress and smiling and going to a big place where he would get sworn into the next position. But yeah, I know for a fact he worked in those different areas. He was undercover for a while. But again, I didn't really know too much. My mom and I kind of joke about it sometimes. He had a really like kind of crappy beat up car, and that was an undercover car, but I had no idea. I just thought my parents were driving a beat up car. And, we weren't allowed in that car, and he had a goatee at the time, and he would wear his badge on a necklace. And as a kid, you don't notice any of those things, it's just dad. So he definitely had a very interesting career and did a lot of different areas of policing. But to me, it was kind of all the same until I really started to dive into it and go through his things and learn more.
Do you remember a time, Erin, where you saw him getting ready for work, maybe, with a vest or whatever else, and you remember being concerned about his safety ever as a child?
Absolutely. I would say almost every Sunday. So my dad, he went to he's a man of routine and did the same thing. So he every Sunday would pick up his dry cleaning, and he got his uniforms dry cleaned at this one place because of safety, and he wanted to really trust the people. And so I remember very vividly every Sunday I would sit there and he would have to put the pins back on his uniform, and I would help him, or I would sit there and just kind of watch him. And I always remember that. That was a really nice memory of Sunday nights. And I think when I was younger, it was more of like idolizing that my dad is a superhero. And as I got a little bit older, it was, okay, this is a little dangerous. I get this now. And then as you get older and older and older, it gets a little harder because you understand the world a little bit more. But yeah, I would definitely ask him, where are you going? What are you doing? Or why, actually, I would say it more so came up if it was leaving like Christmas morning. I remember that there were several times where we were opening presents and we have to put it on pause and do it the next day because my dad's beeper went off or the radio went off. And I think those moments were more scary for me because it was unplanned. So if it was going to work every day like a normal parent, then it was, I think, more normal for me. Like I expected it. But those moments where the radio went off or my dad had to run into work were very scary for me because it was, why is it so urgent? And why are we kind of putting life on pause so that my dad has to get to work? Like that must be something really important. So I think that came out there. But definitely, I love that memory of watching him, get the uniform ready and putting his hat on when he wasn't looking, that kind of thing. Absolutely.
So, it's quite an interesting paradigm because I get a chance to chat a lot with cops who talk about themselves having to not be present for holidays, birthdays, Christmases, Thanksgivings, you name it, they skip it, right? And so holidays become a fluid concept because of the person that works as a first responder, and they know that it's not really attached to a date. But as a child, you don't know that, right? Because to you, Christmas is December 25th, for instance, as a holiday. And so to you, it's like everybody in my class is experiencing Christmas and they're going to write about Christmas break and whatever else. And for you, it was a different experience. So as a child, trying to process what holidays meant and how you kept up with people who were celebrating holidays like Thanksgiving on Thanksgiving. What was that like? I, I feel it will be helpful for first responders to know that as themselves, because because I don't know that many of them even ask their families or their kids what it means to them to have that kind of flexibility, because it's
Sure.
on you.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think that's definitely something that's really unique about first responder children is that that's a norm for us. So now as an adult, I'm marrying into a family. It's a really big Italian family. They're wonderful. And they're always there together at the same time on all the holidays. And for me, that's so not normal because I didn't grow up like that. It was kind of, we celebrate that whenever dad can celebrate that, or whenever he's home, whenever we have time. And so, it's a wonderful thing that some families can do that. But when you grow up in a first responder family, I love the word fluid. Holidays are so fluid. It's not really about the day for us. I think as a kid, when you're young, the challenge is the rest of your family is there. And so you might see other dads, like your uncles or your grandparents, and they're there. And you almost have like a sense of jealousy, like, where's my dad? Or, I want my dad there. I see my uncles there with their kids. But I will say what's harder from a child perspective is when my dad would come up to a family party or a holiday and he was there, but he wasn't there. That was 10 times harder for me. And I'll tell you why. When he was present, all I wanted was my dad, who I was best friends with, super close with, wanted to talk to. But he was very closed off and kind of isolated at family parties or big gatherings. He kind of always was, I don't know if it was hiding his identity or not wanting to talk about work or feeling like he just was still at work. I'm not really sure, what that was, but for a child, that's harder because he was there, but not there, if that makes any sense. Like his body was there, but if you ran up to him to talk to him, he was really quiet. That was probably harder for other family members to get closer with him because he was so quiet at those parties. And I think my mom, my sister, and I saw a different side of my dad at home, but he was never that guy at these family parties. It was almost like he was constantly kind of waiting for questions or not wanting to talk about work or looking for another first responder in the crowd. My grandfather was a firefighter, so they were really like, they could talk about work and hit it off, and that's great. But I think there was always that element of, I don't want to say uncomfortable, but kind of looking for another first responder maybe who got it, or he's still thinking, gosh, I might get called into work. And we, for a while, lived in the city. I was a baby, but we lived in the city where my dad worked. So he would get called in way quicker because he lived right there. I don't really remember that part of my life, but I know that that was a concern too, is that you're constantly there. So anytime we went to that city, and this is like for church, for dinner, anything like that, my dad was on the job. His brain was not physically, it wasn't in his body at that moment. It was just him. So I would say that's even harder than missing the holiday. And it's because you expect and you want them there so badly, but they're not present in the moment. And I think that's a little bit harder for a kid just because we don't understand why.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get why dad doesn't want to talk to me or hang out with me or sit with me at the table and talk about not work, but my own school or whatever I was. I think that might be a little bit more challenging. You get used to the fluid holiday, the ever-changing dates because you were born into that. So my dad was always the first responder. So it was never very regimented or routine. My whole life has kind of been like that. I think I drive my fiance crazy because I am so not routine and he's a very routine man. But yeah, I mean, you grow up knowing that everything is just really flexible.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. You probably learned flexibility is a key to success because you've had to do it. You were forced into it, right?
Absolutely.
And it works. You mentioned dad being like a wallflower, when he was in public kind of settings, whether it be around family or other places. And that is such a common phrase that I hear from all of my first responders that go to parties or events, especially family things. Number one, they don't want people asking them silly questions about what they do. They don't want to hear what's the worst thing that ever happened to you on your job, because it really is enraging to have to answer that question. And then they don't know that anybody would relate to them. So what you described of dad reaching out to grandpa and having that relationship is such a common thing that they'll scan the room, see who might be the closest thing to a first responder and just gravitate towards that person. Now, was your grandfather, who did, I think, 40 years plus in fire service, correct?
He did, yeah.
Was he your dad's dad or your mom's dad?
He was actually my mother's dad.
Wow. And so they had a good relationship, regardless that they weren't blood relatives, so to speak, right?
They did. And they were actually, he was a firefighter in the same city that my dad was a police officer. So they knew the city very well too.
Oh, what a great lineage you have. And so this takes you forward now, and you decide, hey, I'm going to study psychology. I want to get interested in this stuff to figure out what I can do to help. Is this a path that you think was set because of your background with your dad and your grandfather?
Absolutely. So I'll tell you a little story. I think this will be helpful. There was this one day, and I always knew my dad had a hard job. I never really knew the ins and outs, of course. I told you he was really private. He wouldn't come home and say, I was in this horrible chase, or, there was a shootout and I was involved. He would never do that. In fact, when it was serious and there was a conversation about work, that was, why don't you guys go watch a movie? And my sister and I would leave the kitchen table and my mom would talk. So we really weren't exposed a lot to the details of his job, but I knew his job was hard. And I knew when he came home from work, he might be my dad. He might be someone who's very upset. He might be someone who just is like not there, almost like a skeleton of who he was. He might be really anxious. He could be a million things. And so that growing up was hard. I really internalized that. I always thought it was my fault, or that I was doing something, or I had done something wrong. Because when he would work, it was a kiss on the forehead. It was, I love you so much. I can't wait to come home and have a great day. And then he would come home. So imagine for a kid, if you're so excited for your dad to come home, and the last thing that you just thought of was that he's really excited to come home and see you, and he's kissing you and saying, I love you. And then he comes home and doesn't say hi to you and walks right by you, almost like you don't exist, or walks in the door and is mad at you, not really mad at you, I know now, but you feel like he's mad at you, or frustrated with you, or nitpicking little things like yelling about the dishwasher when that wasn't really what he was upset about, but it was just one thing that kind of set him off. So all of these different experiences over time, they did at one point kind of strain our relationship, because it was almost like I felt like every time he came home from work, it was either he was mad at me or upset with me, or I had done something wrong, and I was just constantly internalizing it, thinking, gosh, what could I possibly do better to be a better child, or to make you want to hang out with me after work? And I grew up in a neighborhood, like I said, a nice suburban town where parents would come home from work and play with their kid in the backyard and, be really excited, or go for walks. And my dad would come home, and he was this amazing man and loved him so much, but he wasn't that parent to come home from work, change out of his clothes and run and play soccer in the backyard, probably because he saw something pretty horrible at work. And so he's still in that kind of hyper vigilant state. And there was this one moment that I tell this story, and the reason I tell it is because I think it really illuminates kind of the struggle of a first responder, but also the struggle of being a first responder's child and those emotions that come with it. So there was a day, and my dad, I said I was an athlete earlier. I mean, this man never missed a game, a practice, whatever he had to do. If he had to, work, come back from work and then go back to work later, he would. He was awesome. So there was this one day that we had practice, and the practice got canceled. I can't remember why. I was about 16 years old. And, we had just gotten cell phones, but we weren't really good at using, we were using them for texting our friends, but we weren't really good for the reason we got the cell phone, which is to update your parents. So, the practice got canceled. I didn't tell my dad. He was on his way home from work. He waited there for me for about 45 minutes. Now you have to imagine, as a police officer, you're thinking, oh my gosh, where's my kid? Were they taken? Were they waiting for me? And something happened. Home watching TV, popcorn. So he comes through the driveway, and I remember so vividly, this is like more than 10 years ago, but looking up and saying, oh, shoot, I forgot to tell my dad. And he's pulling the driveway. And, typically, of course, he would be upset, right? He wasted 45 minutes. He had a long day at work. But he came through that door. He threw the mail. He was yelling, almost in like this really aggressive, out of his body experience, and so angry, and in a way scared. And in that moment, it's like he snapped out of it when he saw that I was really scared. And the guilt and the shame and all of those feelings, I mean, he just started crying and feeling so awful. And of course I was upset for a second, but I mean, we're kids, we get over it, and we shouldn't have done that. So it was easy to move on for myself, but about that for days. And I couldn't really understand why. I talked to my mom about it a little bit, and I tried talking to him, and he made me sit down with him and he apologized and kind of explained he had a bad day at work. But to this day, I don't really know, obviously, what happened at work or what was going on. Likely he's maybe saw a girl like myself get hurt or, and I was being snarky and didn't really care to let him know about something. And it just kind of hit him in the wrong spot on that day. But I think for me, that sits so, it'll sit with me forever, because it wasn't just that he was carrying all this weight of past trauma and stress. It was now kind of spilling over into his family and causing him guilt and shame and even more sadness and depression and isolation. It was like he had gone through this but couldn't even really share with me why that happened. It was just that he had a bad day at work, but there was so much more behind it. And I think that he was just really felt guilty and had a lot of shame for couldn't handle it. I think too, when you grow up with a first responder parent, they're a superhero, and you tell them that and you draw pictures of them. And, I of photos that are not photos, drawings. It can't be called photos, little scratch drawings of, elementary school where you draw a picture of your parent and it says superhero. And my dad is, and so how do you then look at your daughter and say, I'm struggling or I'm having a hard time with my emotions or the trauma? You don't, because they think that you're Superman. So I think that for me kind of was a turning point in my life where I thought, gosh, there isn't a lot here for support in terms of where he can go. And I was younger then, obviously that was in high school, but it stuck with me. And I went on to go to the University of Connecticut, and I started to study communication. And I just constantly wanted to hear people's stories. This was my story. There's a million stories out there. I want to hear more. I want to know how people are affected by things like trauma and stress and all different types of mental health struggles. And so I went on to get my master's degree in health communication. And so I was really looking at communication surrounding mental health, and did my thesis on mental health communication within police departments to really look at kind of from all angles, from leadership, from lower ranking officers, psychologists who work with police departments, to kind of get all the different perspectives on how it's talked about and where kind of the gaps are in terms of things like stigma, right? How is that still a thing? And that's still going on. And this culture is so deep, and there's so many layers to mental health and wellness and conversations that surround it. And so I didn't have enough. I had to go on and get that PhD because I knew there was more research to be done. And now I'm working on developing a dissertation idea in which I would look different preferences for support. So I've done a lot of research the past year and a half with first responders, and spending time talking, on an interview for an hour or even 30 minutes to hear some of their own experiences. I don't think that there's enough of that in our research. I think that we definitely have a lot of ground to cover in terms of hearing officers out, learning more about what they're experiencing instead of trying to kind of generalize, well, this is, stigma is a thing, or PTS is a problem. It's the little stories, the nuances, the in-between moments that officers go through, whether it's with their family or whatever it might be. Those are the things that need to get told, because without that understanding, it's impossible to make change that's going to be meaningful for them. So a lot of the times people will come in and say, well, here's a one-size-fits-all fix. We're going to put in this program and it's going to be great. Well, maybe some officers won't utilize that resource, or maybe some officers don't know how to access it. And so hopefully what my dissertation will be doing is looking at different preferences for support. I think that's a really important thing to think about. There's not a ton of research out there about what specifically you need as a police officer for support. I think definitely there's some wonderful, wonderful resources that have already been proven to be really effective and helpful. But I want to know more so about the range of different things that officers go through and how they can be best supported from their perspective. Instead of prescribing something, I want to hear from them. Here's how I would have liked to be supportive. And if they don't have an answer, if they don't know how they want to be supportive, that's data in itself. And that's important to know too, because a lot of the times, I don't know if I asked my dad in those moments what he would have needed, if he would have known, but that's a conversation to be having and to be thinking about, well, let's work through that and decide what might be helpful. And I know later on in my dad's career, he did go see a psychologist at one point and was diagnosed with depression and PTS, and but it took so long to get to that point. And so I think if we can focus on the stories and what's going on and look at preferences, it's going to help be more preventative than backtracking, reading it afterward.
So true. And, I commend you for doing your PhD to try to explore this and for wanting to add more qualitative research. You and I talked about the importance of having qualitative research where you have those conversations with people and then figure out how you're going to use that information afterwards. Sometimes we spend so much time on quantitative data and we give pre-employment tests. We try to determine personality and all sorts of stuff, but personality changes, especially due to brain injury, head injuries, trauma. These things shape how the cop actually ends up becoming any firefighter, any first responder, ends up coming towards their 17th year of their career, their 25th year of their career, the 32nd year of their career. And then before you know it, you get to your dad's spot, which is almost unheard of. Not many cops, especially nowadays, would ever do 37 years of service. It just is very rare for it to happen. But I think that we also have these differences between types of departments. So the East Coast style of policing compared to Central Corridor, Midwest, compared to the West Coast policing. You and I had a brief conversation about that. How do conservative departments differ to liberal departments or in between departments, where the difference in stigma and resources that are available to people, social services that are available to first responders, are accepted by that first responder as well as available to that first responder if they will look to seek it out. You and I didn't get a chance to chat about this, but one of the really amazing things in Arizona, and I think Arizona is still the only state to have this, is that we have House Bill 2502, which is labeled as the Craig Tiger Act. And Craig Tiger was an officer that died by suicide here in Arizona. And one of the great things about it is that it sparked reform in our statutes so that officers here in Arizona and sworn folks who are first responders, so firefighters, officers, they're allowed up to 36 sessions per year, which is covered by the department or the city, which is incredible because now they no longer have to worry about how they're going to afford treatment or therapy. It is given to them. They're allowed to attend while they're on their shift. So it really is a very progressive way to be able to take care of our first responders. I hope that more departments and more cities, more states follow in these footsteps and realize the critical role that the first responder has and the types of things that you witnessed as a child of a first responder, right? I mean, dad is coming home, he's blowing up, right? You're 16 years old, you were doing what a 16-year-old does, which is be self-centered, is normal, right? And then you had the aha moment, I forgot, right, to call and tell dad, perfectly normal. And then all of a sudden dad does what he does, which is normal, which is for him, his experience base says, my child could have been abducted, et cetera, et cetera. And what he's really trying to show you is, I'm relieved to see you, but in my relief to see you, I'm going to scream at you so you never do that again, right? But what you described with him breaking down and having that conversation afterwards, that's really powerful that he was able to pivot and to do that so quickly. It sounds like he was having almost like an adrenaline dump after he encountered you and was able to have peace of mind that his baby was okay,
Yeah, and it goes along with if you've read Dr. Gil Martin's book about the hypervigilance roller coaster, reading that now, 10 years later, I'm reading that and I'm sitting, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. He was at this hypervigilant state. He went to pick me up. I was gone. Hypervigilant still there, right? Now it's involving his own child and then crashing down. And like I said, he was in that in that mode of shame and guilt and sadness for days because it was just so heavy. Like he had brought it to his kid and done this and upset his child.
Yeah, so within your teenage years, or maybe a little bit younger, do you remember staying awake at night because you were worried about dad's safety, about him coming home or not coming home? And how did
Definitely.
that transform?
Absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off
and
there.
how did it transform as you got older?
Sure. So again, my dad worked the night when I was a child. I think it was about, end of elementary into middle, maybe a little bit of high school. And so that really, that was a hard time for me because I knew it was dangerous at nighttime. I also knew that was a dangerous city. I knew that was because my dad never wanted me there. He never wanted me to be, going out with my friends there or driving through or anything like that. The city seemed so dangerous by protecting me from it that it made me more nervous. And I don't think he knew he was doing this, but it made me more nervous because if it was that dangerous for me to be there, I don't want you there every night. That was my mindset. But, it was safe enough for him, but not safe enough for me. But as a kid, you're thinking, gosh, if I can't go there, I don't want my dad there. So definitely nights where I would stay up and just kind of think about it, or, I know this is not what you asked, but this is another kind of layer of it. We even sometimes would think about, was I nice enough to my dad, or did I say, the right thing before he left for work? Like a normal kid, you yell at your parents and you're snarky back to them. And, you have those moments where maybe you said something you shouldn't have said. And for, any kid, you don't think about the repercussions of that, or that being your last thing. I don't mean to be morbid, but that being the last thing that you say to your parent. And we had a rule in our house, always say goodbye on a good note, because you don't know if dad is going to get hurt or come back from work. And that's
Mhm.
heavy as a kid, to think about, well, I have to say goodbye because he might not come home, or he might be hurt at work, or something might happen. So absolutely, I carried that around, and it's definitely anxiety provoking. You kind of feel like you're waiting for that moment where he kisses you on the forehead because you're like, oh, okay, he's home. And he always thought I was asleep, but little secret, I wasn't usually asleep when he would come in. And, you have that moment of relief where you're like, oh, okay, he's home, he's safe. We made it through another shift, and maybe now he has 3 days off, or, he's going back tomorrow night. But yeah, you do as a kid, you do and internalize that feeling of, I just want him to be home. And I think another layer of that is my mom, right? Like, as being the spouse of a first responder, she had to be on it all the time. She had to be getting my sister and I ready for whatever we had to do that day. And, because he worked nights, he slept during the day. So it was hard for him to like bring us to school or bring us to all this. And so trying not to feed off of that stress too. She did a wonderful job. My mother is the second superhero of the home. And, she tried her very best not to be stressed out, but you as a kid kind of feed off of that as well. And I think something that most people wouldn't think about, but as you go to people's houses, so growing up as a kid, if you go to a friend's house and you kind of watch the dynamic. I was always a very observant child, and I think this was engraved in me because when you grow up as a first responder, I'll say this first, there are little nuances that you will, things like my dad, if you go to a restaurant, he sat chair at the table. It wasn't, I'm just going to sit wherever. He always had first dibs because he had to sit facing the door. If we were in a hotel room, he would watch and he would make sure it was a safe area. And so there's all these little nuances of things that you notice as a kid. And while you feel very safe because your dad is always looking out, it kind of makes you feel anxious. And on the other side of the coin, because you're like, why are we always watching out? What are we watching out for? Or why can't our name be in the phone book, but every other kid's name is in the phone book? And why can't you wear your uniform outside of work? Or why are you putting on a t-shirt after work so that no one knows you're a police officer in the grocery store? And why, so you're kind of thinking, it's him being safe and protecting you. But as a kid, and you don't say this, but you're thinking in your head, what are we looking out for? Or like, what is coming after us? Why can't I tell people that my dad's a police officer? Or why can't we be in the phone book? I don't know why, but that was a huge thing. When we were a kid, we wanted to be in the phone book so bad,
Yeah.
which sounds so silly now. And phone books, gosh, that makes me sound kind of old. But, I think those little moments are kind of when it makes you question, like, okay, maybe we aren't safe, or maybe I am nervous about this. But when you go to friends' parents' houses and you're kind of sitting there and things are very different, I think that's another time where you kind of notice, I have to keep my wits about me. I have to know what I'm doing at all times. And my other friends don't do that, or my other friends, aren't constantly worried about these things, but I am. And I kind of, growing up they always called me like the mom role, but really what I was doing is being safe. I was always the friend that was safe because my dad had engraved that into my head. And so I apologize for getting kind of away from that question, but I think those are important things. Those are the different, almost like I keep calling them in between moments. It's nothing that's super big that would kind of stick out, or, that one example, that was a big story. But these are the in between moments that build and build and build and build to kind of make you who you are. So as you grow up with being safe and constantly looking out, and don't always trust everyone. It was always, don't trust just because you met them once. It's, you have to build relationships. And that came from my dad for sure. If you are in a car, make sure that you're, of course, parents tell you wear your seatbelt, but this was like to a different degree. You're wearing a seatbelt, check this, check that, make sure this. And so it was just always a safety thing, and knowing who to call, and being sure that, you were always, always, always safe, and thinking about safety. So it kind of comes into your brain as almost an anxiety provoking thing, because why do I have to think about safety so much when my friends aren't? So again, I don't know if that kind of deterred you from the question. I apologize so much, but
It is absolutely perfect. And I want to ask two follow-up questions from that point, but I want to stick with this line that you're on right now. Did you ever violate that safety bond and trust? And then did you get reamed for it from him? And how bad was that?
absolutely. I think because it was so prominent and something that was talked about so much, and my sister will say the opposite, so you should figure out next. But she was more of, okay, here's the line, I'm going to stay right behind the line to make sure I don't cross it. I was the second child, so I had to mix things up a little bit. So I would always toe over the line just to see what would happen. And my dad and I were really close. We had a very fun, loving relationship. So I would kind of, joking way, but very quickly realized it was not funny. And, so there would be moments where, maybe I would come home instead of 11, I would come home at 11:03 just to feel it out. Just being a silly teenager. Or there would be moments where, I wasn't supposed to be at this location, or, I wasn't supposed to be hanging out with these specific people, or things like that. And, my dad would always actually handle it in a way that was very, I don't know, how would I word this? He knew me. So he very much knew how to approach the situation. He was very good at explaining. I think this is where he kind of came into explaining his job. It was from a safety perspective always. And I think this is something too that's kind of important for anyone that's listening, is I think in their head, father's head, it was, I'm going to explain my job in a safety lens. Like, always talk about, I want you to be safe because blank. For example, we could never have Razor scooters. I don't know if you remember those, but they were like the coolest thing when I was growing up. And I always wanted a Razor scooter with the green wheels and the green handlebars. I wanted one so bad, but I couldn't get one. And it wasn't because my parents were being mean. That's of course what I thought. It was, my dad had responded to a call, and this kid was on a Razor scooter and got hit by a car and died. And so, that was what my dad had in his mind. He had seen this horrible thing that he had to respond to, and this poor child that was killed from being on a Razor scooter. And so, that's why I couldn't have a Razor. It wasn't because, they were just being mean, or because they didn't want me to be cool and fit in with everyone else. And so, those experiences that my dad would have at work made so much sense for why he had certain roles in place for me and to keep me safe. And I know that now, but when you're growing up as a kid, you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's fine and safe. But definitely, that was that was a challenge. I think it was hard for me to understand at first, but when he did take the time to explain things, it worked really well because he would explain it in a way that, listen, this is what happens if you do this. He would even go as far as one time I was being quite the rebel and wanting to go to a party when I wasn't supposed to, or, take the car and I was only 18 or whatever it might be. And he would bring me into the city and show me, here's a neighborhood of where you could end up if you do, and it was not to threaten me, but to show me like these are what the things I see, and I'm trying to protect you from this.
Mm-hmm.
And so he did a good job of really explaining why he was so tough on me for certain things. And you know what that did is when I grew up and got even older, I had this like enhanced layer of integrity. Like I always wanted to do the right thing because my dad explained it to me from that perspective. He took the time and said, listen, this is why this rule is in place. This is why this is a law. This is why kids can't do this. This is why you have to be home by 11. And so it was never just, I said so, that's it. It was always, let me explain this to you from a safety perspective. And so I did. I grew up to be a very safe person who thinks a lot about the laws and why things are in place. But I credit that to my dad, and the integrity factor. I mean, that's the middle name of a police officer. And so, he engraved that into me as well, is, you're supposed to be doing the right thing, even when no one's do that for the rest of your life. And so he used those moments very well to say, listen, I know that you're a teenager. I know that these are things you want to be doing, but look what can happen if you do that.
Mm-hmm.
So he did a good job of that. And I think that that's really a valuable lesson from a first responder parent, because they do see the worst of the worst and they carry that and they remember that. And so I don't think that he ever really talked to me about his own experiences at work and what it did to him internally, but he did a really good job of explaining why things are important for my own safety.
I think that's so nice and so great of him to do that. That is something that I think, as you were saying that story, I think parents who are first responders watching this could definitely benefit and learn from your dad, as well as kids, how you were could, and if any kids do get a chance to watch this, and hopefully some first responder parents might share this with their kids, the kids could understand and have a basis for why the parents may not actually disclose things, but they're telling them to do certain things, and of course, kids, if you don't understand it, you start to make up reasons to why you should resist it, right? But understanding that there might just be something that you have to wait until you get older, like yourself, to find out, hey, this makes sense now. I just wish, they had told us why earlier on.
Right.
So I was very curious about this as it relates to, and you never told me this about your family, so I don't know if there's any truth or any kind of basis to this, but in first responder families, sometimes there's abuse that takes place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to disclose that at all, because that's not the question I'm asking you. But in abusive families, what happens sometimes is that the kid ends up having behavioral or educational issues because they are afraid to go to school, and then something bad might happen to a parent at home. So I'm taking that paradigm now. Let's assume that there was none of that in your household, but let's assume now that you were scared about dad being hurt at work. And so did you carry that to school with you? And did you have any kind of outbursts or any kind of educational issues because you were so concerned about dad's safety?
I don't know if I had educational issues. I think it was more, again, I keep using the word internalize, and I apologize. I need a better word to use, but that's the best word that I can really come up with right now to explain those feelings and those emotions and how it impacted me. So I always wanted to do A+ work so that I can come home and show my dad, because I knew my dad was having a hard time at work, or, I was just anxious to get back to my dad and to have that relationship. And like I told you, sometimes he would be really friendly and sweet and kind, and sometimes he would be really angry and not there and just sit in his chair and watch TV, literally staring at it like this and not talking. And so I think for me, when I was at school, I was so fixated on making him proud.
Mm-hmm.
And I projected that kind of emotional roller coaster on myself, thinking if I can just do really good work and make him proud, he'll come home and he'll be excited, or I can get him, I can make him happy after work if I do a really good job. And so, and this is something I struggled with my entire life, but at school, if I didn't, let's say I got one thing wrong on a worksheet or a paper, I'm in second grade, I would cross it out if it said good job and put bad job. And I would write, do better next time. And I was so hard on myself. If I didn't get 100%, I would sit there and redo it and redo it and redo it. And looking back now, it makes sense. What I was trying to do is trying to be perfect so that, I could make that easier for my dad because other things were so hard. But at that moment, my parents didn't really know why I was doing it. Teachers were nervous because, your daughter's doing fine. I don't know why she's being so hard on herself. And that kind of reflects on her parents, right? Are they pressuring you so much at home to be perfect? I mean, my mom was a teacher herself. She never pressured me to do any better than what I was doing. And she was a wonderful elementary school teacher. And, so it kind of didn't make sense at first to a lot of people, including even myself. I don't know why. I was a kid and I was so hard on myself. I'm telling you, even if it was, I got one thing wrong, I would be in a horrible mood and write mean things to myself on my paper. And so I think, not that I carried the stress of his job to work, but I definitely internalized what had gone on after he came home from work and was trying to be so perfect that it didn't matter what day he was having, he would come home and want to say hi to me. That was in my head. If I could just be perfect at school and be perfect at sports and be perfect at all of these things, then maybe it won't matter. And he'll come home and say hi to me no matter what. Or he'll come home and want to hang out with me because I'm perfect now. And so I think that was more so something I recognized in school. And then the other half of that is social. So, it's definitely not uncommon to hear people speak really badly about police officers or to use certain language. I don't have to go through the things that people call police officers, but it's hard when you're a kid and you hear those things and your parent is your parent and you love them and you're proud of their job and other people aren't. And so, that wasn't really in elementary school, but as I got older, even in high school, or this carried on through college and still even now, it's so hard not to get defensive, not to be upset, not to kind of bring all of those emotions with you every time you hear someone bring up a police officer in a negative way. But I think in terms of the safety factor and thinking about my dad at work, it was more so preparing for when he came home to make sure I could be perfect and good and make sure I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, because I knew when he came home, it was always rough. Like I knew what he was doing at work, something was hard, but never really the details. And I think he was trying to protect me from knowing exactly what he did. In fact, the only time he would really include me in his work would be if he was working at like the arena for the night and it was a basketball game. UConn used to play at the city where he worked in Bridgeport. They have this arena and, the UConn girls would come down from Storrs, Connecticut, and they would play. And my dad and I love sports, so he would bring me there. And his job seemed so safe. I mean, he was standing outside the arena and welcoming people into the arena. So he really was strategic about letting me see what he was doing at work. And I think that he did a good job of that growing up, because I really never knew how dangerous it was. There was only one or two times I think that I saw him on the news as a kid and realized, whoa, they're saying shooting and my dad's face is right here. So what was he doing there, or why was he involved? And there was another incident too. I don't mean to go so long with this question, I apologize, but I think this story is important to share. It was 4th of July and we were supposed to have this big family picnic, and my dad was hyped about it. And he normally, like I said, was pretty quiet at family parties and very reserved, but he was excited. And so we were having it at our house, and he had to work that day, but I think it was a half day shift. And he worked in a city where there was this big park, and these women pulled over, and it was a one woman in the car and 3 kids. She pulled over for directions. She was trying to get to a picnic and she couldn't find the street. And so she put her car in park and went out of her car for just a second. Her kids are still in the car. I think it was 2 of her own kids and 1 kid that she was, a family friend or something. And she gets out of the car to ask for directions, and the child in the car hits the shift and it goes into the water. And, her kids are in the car, they're drowning now, they're in the water, and it was almost like a whirlpool. So that where that car went in was probably one of the worst places for, not that there's any good place for that to happen, but it was like, an even more intensified situation. And then, my dad was the first on the scene before anyone else. And then the woman dove in after her children, and they ended up dying. And that was how my dad was spending the first half of his 4th of July. And then he had to come home to this family picnic, and he was silent. And, I just figured, here's another time that my dad is being cranky or not talking to anyone at a family party. Like, what a letdown. And then it wasn't until later that night, we're watching the 11 o'clock news, and there's my dad on the screen, and he's the one that responded first. And the next morning he's on the front page of the paper. And so, I think because there wasn't a lot of communication about it from him directly coming home, it was almost like everything was, he's just in a bad mood, or he just, I did something to tick him off again. I don't know what it was, but because there wasn't a good, what's a good way for someone to come home and say, happy 4th of July, this is how I spent my morning. There isn't. And so you kind of see both sides, especially as the child, because how is he supposed to look at his daughter and tell him that, or tell her that, but how am I supposed to know that that's what happened? And so there's kind of this like pull between, you want to tell your kid so that they don't think it's them, but you also can't tell your kid what you just saw. And so, I had to see it on the news, but those aren't things that you carry with you every single day. It's more so that you carry a strong sense of pride. Number one, my dad saves lives for a living, and he does the hard things that other people don't want to do. And my dad was such a man of integrity and passion, and always, put his 100% heart into his work. And so I carried that with me. And I would say in the school setting, or how it kind of carried over, was more so just me wanting to be so good. I wanted to be so perfect because my dad had a hard job, and I just wanted him to come home and be proud of me. So for me, it was a little bit different than I think what you're describing, but I can absolutely see how, that tension between, they never tell me anything and he's always in a bad mood, so I guess I'll just rebel. I can completely see that being, something that happens, because the lack of communication is very frustrating, because you're not understanding why your parents sometimes, in your head, you're like, sometimes they like me and sometimes they don't like me. Why is that? That's not normal. Parents normally like you all the time. And so I think I can definitely see how that would happen for a kid. And, it's attention too. You're not feeling like you're getting the same attention that other kids are from their parent. I felt that very often, where, you come home, and I said, going over a friend's house, their kids run up to their parents and say hi after work, and they're so excited, and you get jealous of that. You kind of have a sense of envy, like, why don't I have that? Or why don't I have any normalcy? Or, maybe I don't want to be flexible this year. I want to have Christmas on Christmas, or, so I think that definitely that happens.
Your life is just so fascinating, and I think so helpful too. And this information that you're sharing is, I think, a blessing for a lot of people to be able to hear and to experience. I know that we're running up against the clock, but I have so many questions to ask you still.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I do want to ask you is, as you've grown, now you're a full-fledged woman. You're no longer this child of your father. You'll always be, but you know what I mean. Have you noticed that modeling of behavior, because I don't know what mom was like, right? But have you noticed that modeling of behavior of dad, inconsistent mood, kind of, all over the place, not really quite sure what to expect? Do you find like you embody that and you exude that too as part of who you are as an adult? Has that shaped who you are?
A little bit, yeah. I would definitely think that my experiences throughout my childhood have definitely made me into the person I am. I think too, I just mentioned the sense of pride and integrity and doing the right thing. I think no matter what emotions my dad was going through, he was a strong believer in, you do what's right because it's right, not because someone's looking, not because you want the recognition. I mean, when you're a police officer, it's not about recognition. It's not about money. It's not about fame. I mean, they don't have any of those things. So it's about heart, and doing what's right and helping people. And he engraved that into me. So I carry that with me every day. Everything I do, you know, the focus is helping someone else. And I think that that's really powerful. And I think that's a huge benefit of being a first responders kid, because you grow up watching your parent have to sacrifice a ton of things to help other people. They're constantly thinking about anyone else but them. And I think, you know, although it's a strain on it could be a huge strain on your own mental health as a kid growing up. I told you myself, I'm still very hard on myself, and I still carry that perfectionism mindset, and it's, you know, still very much linked to I just wanted to make him proud always, and in that kind of thing. So I still have that. I suffer with anxiety myself, and that's definitely something that came out of a variety of those different experiences, you know, waiting up for my dad or saying goodbye to him thinking, oh my gosh, I hope he doesn't get hurt, or I hope he comes home, can he make it to my game, will he be late, will something go wrong? And so definitely that comes out of that, and the anxiety of am I enough is something that came out of growing up from those experiences. You know, I always questioned if I was better, would he be in a better mood? And I think that would break his heart if he heard that. But that's really what I was carrying is, what am I doing wrong? How can I be better so that he will want to come home and hang out with me? Or he won't be so standoffish, or he won't be so bitter and angry. And it had nothing to do with me at all. But he didn't explain that to me. And so, you know, you carry that. But I think too, another thing that's huge is just really understanding that, you know, integrity and the pride and all those positive things, they don't come without the negatives. And so there are things that, you know, are kind of negative that still carry on. And that's one of them, is that internalizing, trying to be perfect and trying to be the best so that I can impress him. But that kind of fluctuating between happy and angry and not there, and, you know, thinking of me as invisible, and that kind of roller coaster that I was on too. You know, we talk about the hypervigilance roller coaster for a first responder. I would argue that right next to it is a different ride. It's definitely a roller coaster family. And I think you
Erin,
have to be really flexible, but also it makes you, oh, sorry.
I think
Yeah.
that it froze
Can you hear
there.
me?
Yeah, I think it froze for 1 second. Joys
Oh,
of the net of doing this stuff. I'm sorry, but because it's been a little bit choppy at times. But could you repeat that part? You said right alongside of the first responder going through an emotional roller coaster or hypervigilance. I could assume what you said, but if you don't mind saying that final part again.
of course. Yeah, I know the internet is a little bit choppy here sometimes, but yeah, so I would tell you, if we're in an amusement park and this is the hyper vigilant roller coaster for an officer, right next to that is another roller for the family. I mean, they're going through all of those feelings too, if not additional feelings, because we don't have insight into that person's thoughts and feelings, and we want to help and you want to be involved, but they don't know always how to communicate that. And I think my mom had very different experiences, so I'm talking more so as a child. But another thing that I wanted to kind of mention, I don't know if this was breaking up there, but you know, the pride and the passion and all those positive things, they don't come for free. And so there's also a whole trajectory of other kind of negative emotions that you go through. So you know, are always kind of uncertain about how people are feeling about you. So I'll question, you know, if I feel like I've upset someone or someone's angry with me, I will kind of fixate on that. And that's has a ton to do with my childhood and growing up, where I never knew what I was doing wrong. So it's so frustrating for me. You know, this really stands out to me. If someone is upset or is, you know, seems like they don't like me or seems like I've done something wrong and doesn't tell me why, I fixate and I can't get over it. I have to know why. And I think it's because I never knew what was going on with my dad's emotions and how I was playing into that. So even, you know, with my fiance, if he gets, you know, upset or something's wrong, I make him talk about it to me. And that's something that, you know, maybe not a lot of people have to go through, but it's something for me. I get anxious. I need to know why there's a problem or why someone's upset. And that goes along definitely with what I grew up with, because I never knew why. I never knew what was going on. So I have definitely an urge to always know things, and I get very anxious about that kind of stuff.
Makes total sense, of course, right? I mean, as you're an adult now, you could reflect on it and have this increased self-awareness. You mentioned before we started recording that you had done focus groups with other children of first responders. And I wanted to get your snapshot perspectives on what the feedback was that you got from them that were aha moments saying, wow, you guys do this too?
Yeah, a lot of that was the defensive factor. So we were, that was about last semester. So it had been last spring. And kind of that defensive factor of, yeah, it was hard growing up as a first responder's child, but we don't want to hear one bad thing from anyone else about first responders, about their job, about what they do, because unless you know first responders and understand what they're going through, you can't make a judgment. And so that's hard for us as first responders kids to hear those negative comments, because you don't know that my dad had to work 2 shifts and left Christmas morning and hasn't been at Thanksgiving and came home and was exhausted and sat in front of the TV. And then he had a fight with my mom because he wasn't present. And you don't know all of those things. And so it's very hard not to get defensive as a first responders kid. I think another thing we talked about, and it almost became like this group therapy session, because you don't have a lot of people that understand it unless they have a parent who's a first responder. It's hard to understand a first responder, what they're going through, unless you are a first responder or have that connection. It's very similar to a child of a first responder, but having that ability to know that your parent is really in a dangerous situation, but being able to move on with your day and still kind of tuck that away in a space where you can still function, right? If we just were worried about our parent all day long, we would have gotten nothing done. So you kind of have to be very resilient as a first responder's child. You have to be able to adapt. And even when something's really challenging or bothering you, or you want your parent there and they can't be there because they're saving someone else's family, being able to push forward and to just be resilient, I think is the strongest kind of theme that came out of that discussion. Was we have to adapt. We don't have a choice. And it's not, I know people have been upset about maybe not being with their families because of COVID, or they had to miss holidays and things like that. And we kind of jokingly were saying, we've never had, Christmas on Christmas with our whole family, or like, we always have to reschedule things. It does. It makes you very resilient. It makes you, this person who is more so focused on, I want my loved one home and safe. I support what they do. They have a really hard job. And so I think it's one, trying not to be defensive, kind of battling with, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You kind of have this like protective response because you've gone through this with the first responder, right? My dad's the trajectory of his career, I went along, I have pictures of every, promotion and all these things that he's done. You live that with that person. And so you have such a strong, my pride for the police department, especially where my dad was the police department. Those people that are working at that department, family. And so I think that you also have a sense of pride, and it's hard to articulate it to someone who doesn't understand first responders or first responder families. And so I think we kind of bonded over the fact that we have this strong sense of resilience. And then, I told you my friends used to refer to me as like the mom or the responsible one. And so, all of us had that in common. And that's because, you're raised to, I won't go over that again, to know why things need to be safe and to know the importance of taking care of others, having that integrity and being focused on keeping everyone safe. And so you kind of fall into that role of almost caretaker, because you've been raised that way, you've watched it, and kids are so resilient. We also are very, very observant, and we're trained to be observant as a first responder kid. Like I told you, you don't just pick a chair at the dinner table. It's where am I going to be able to see the door? Or, I don't want to wear my uniform because someone might know us and follow us home from the grocery store, things like that. So you kind of learn to be just on it all the time, which can be exhausting too, and can also be really kind of socially isolating. So when you're in college, and I hope if anyone's listening to this and you're in college and you're kind of struggling with, there's so many opportunities to do bad things, right? There's so many opportunities to do what you're not supposed to be doing. And it's hard to be the one that believes in the safety and believes in the integrity and following the rules. And it's hard. It's really, really hard not to be the one drinking at the party and to know that, I'm not supposed to be doing this and I was raised not to do this. And I'm going to stick to my guns, but sometimes it's socially isolating. You become kind of the like, oh, you're going to tell on me. And you know what? That's probably how police officers feel at those family parties or at those other gatherings is, oh, I don't want to drink in front of so-and-so because I'll get a ticket, or even those kind of comments. We get them too as kids, we don't kind of almost viewed as like a whistleblower or someone that's going to, cause havoc because we are the goody two shoes. That's hard, especially when you're in a younger age. Now I'm, 28 and I don't really care what people think about that, but it's very hard. That was something I struggled with a lot in college, was feeling like I don't fit in because it's almost like you mature quicker because you've heard those stories, right? Like the Razor scooter, other kids are like, oh, they're not safe. My parents sat me down and explained the call that he went on and what he saw. And so you kind of just have a different perspective. But I hope if anyone and you're in college or in that kind of scenario, just stick with it. I mean, we're taught to have that integrity and that pride. And I know that it's hard, but there's other people that are feeling the same thing. And that's something I struggled with really a lot in college. But I stuck to my guns, and I've always been who I was. So, I've always stuck to being Erin Craw, and part of Erin Craw is that last name and what my dad taught me. And so I carry that around with me everywhere.
Well, Erin, thank you so much for doing this. I mean, you are an excellent role model and example for sticking to your guns and doing the right thing and living a great life with a successful educational and hope to be, employment career ahead, which I know will happen. That's a given because you have such drive, and as you call it, perfectionism, but there's also a great drive attached to it. And I want to pay respects to your father and to your grandfather and thank them, wholeheartedly for their service to the community, which honestly makes our entire nation stronger, and it makes it better. And every single life that has contributed like a drop in that bucket does something to improve our entire nation's community. So thank you for sharing about your dad and about your family and about yourself in such a meaningful way. And I predict that you and I will have more conversations. It just is such a pleasure getting to know you and for all of the stuff that you shared today. So thank you so much. Anything else that you wanted to share before we finish today?
Yeah, I'll just share one more thing, and you're so welcome. And I thank you too. I'm so excited to be connected with you and to learn from you and to, of course, share my story. And again, if I can help anyone that's listening that's a child of a first responder and who might feel isolated or feel like they're internalizing those kinds of feelings, know that you're not alone. And I think I'll just share this one last story. And this is really me. I think does a really good job of demonstrating the needs to be in a police. My dad had passed away when I was 21 years old, and I was just about to graduate from UConn. And, it was his goal to make it to my graduation, but unfortunately he passed away the summer before my senior year. And so, with that in mind, all of his friends at the department kept thinking, what can we do to support her? What can we do to, my dad wasn't going to be at graduation. That was going to be huge for me and really challenging. And I told you we were so close. And so I didn't know this, but they had something planned in the mix, and it's graduation day now, and you can picture me in my cap and gown, and I'm in Gamble Pavilion. It's huge, and I'm just thinking, you're gonna laugh. I'm just thinking, right hand, shake with your right hand, do because you're in a crowd with all these people. So I'm not thinking about anything but that at that moment. Of course, I woke up that morning thinking, gosh, I wish my dad was here. But in that one moment, I was thinking, shake with your right hand, don't mess this up. And as I get there, I'm shaking with my right hand, and I just feel this tap on my shoulder, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I messed it up. Or who, who is trying to get my attention right now, like at this moment? It was all of my dad's really close friends and partners in full uniform. And they were there to take a picture with me that I should have been having, that moment with my dad, but he couldn't be there. And so I just feel this tap, and I hear from a voice that obviously I knew. I grew up, these were like my uncles, the uncles that weren't blood related. And so I knew these people very well. And they said, your dad can't be here, but I am. And so they're standing there, and I'll send you the news articles all over the Connecticut news.
Yeah.
And it was just the most magical moment. And it just really makes you feel like, yes, there's a ton out there about negative things about policing, and there's so many issues. But when you're a part of that family, you have such a different insight into the soul and the love behind being an officer. And there's four of his friends standing there, full uniform, handing me flowers. I'm getting my picture taken. Of course, I'm sobbing, so the photo is awful. But they're there, and they're just so kind. And my dad always wanted me to take a ride in his new car. He was so proud of this car. He got a black Charger his last couple of years, and I was always away at college, so I never was like going for a ride in the driveway was like a little lame to be doing that at 21 years old. So I just never did it. And then he got so sick and he wasn't driving anymore. And he said, I remember him he was still in hospice at this time, and he was unfortunately passing away. But he said, I'm going to get you for a ride in that car. And I'm like, okay, Dad, we'll see. We'll see. And so I step outside of Gamble, and his car was there. So, and they just made everything so special. And they went out of their way to make sure that on that day, Dad was there in any way that he could have been. So, they brought his car, and they sat with me, and they came to dinner that night. And so I just tell that story because, there is a lot of negativity growing up. It's a struggle. You become really resilient. There's a lot of things that you go through as a child of a first responder. But there's also that wonderful thing about being part of a police family. And it's so strong, and the support is incredible. And you just constantly feel like you're still a part of it. They'll check in on my mom and I. And so that pride and that it's such an honor and such a privilege to be able to do research that might one day help, even if it helps one officer. I mean, I have that strong sense of pride that, gosh, these people for me since I was a baby. And so if I can do anything to give back, I love to tell that story. I think that's really meaningful from the police family perspective.
You made me tear up. That's a very touching story. I could picture it in my head. So, I mean, that's just a really lovely story. Thanks, Brendan, on that note, Erin. And thanks for the work that you're doing and the research that you'll be doing. I look forward to seeing how it develops and hopefully being able to help you if I can.
Good. Thank you so much for having me. And again, it's such a privilege and an honor. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.